one began as a slave. That's not what God put you here for.
If you know anything about the history of slavery, that's the first thing that they did. They beat your history and your native tongue out of you. And what's amazing about America, even the state of Texas the school board is now expunging slavery out of the books so they won't have to be held accountable for what they did.
It's going to be difficult for people to prove intellectual inferiority. That's why even in our textbooks in school, they don't like to teach our children about black inventions, because even greater than our African history are our American inventions. Because from nowhere, you're coming up with things that revolutionize the American social and economic order.
Well, basically, there is a proverb that says that the only thing that peoples of European descent ever created was the patent office, because they stole everybody else's ideas and put their name on it.
During slavery, because you were the property of your master, a lot of what we invented was automatically given credit to the master. The credit was forwarded to the master because we was property. We weren't allowed to take fame or notoriety for the things we created.
Anything that made work easier. Why would white people want to invent something that make work easier when they have black folks to do it?
You have a huge incentive to try to get things to move smoothly so that, you don't get any more lashes, or somebody doesn't now have to sell someone else in your family. There was a lot of incentive to create inventions.
And that's another thing. Most of our black inventors had to deal with idea theft. White folks would come in and say, we did it first because we didn't necessarily know the process or have the money to patent our inventions. So white folk will find out what a black person invented and go do it real fast and get their application in, because back then the process wasn't as thorough as it is now. Whoever got their application in first to the patent office, that's who got the patent. So we got thousands of inventions by black people. We'll never even know it because of the fact that they were stolen.
They don't want anyone to know that we invented things. If it wasn't for black people, white people couldn't take a dump. A black man invented the toilet, and he just made it white on purpose.
A slave by the name of Black Sam, Eli Whitney Slade, created the idea for the cotton gin, and his master took it and patented in his own name. How could he do that with no benefit of books? He wasn't even allowed to learn.
A lot of people assume just because African slaves were illiterate, they were ignorant. And there's a real big difference, because African people, they had a very elaborate language or elaborate languages over in Africa. When Africans were brought over here, they were taught a bastardized version of English, and they weren't even allowed to see the language written down. And they were taught the language by lower class Europeans who were living in the South. So even though there was that major obstacle, blacks still did phenomenal things. Thomas Edison was known for stealing people's inventions. He was known for taking the inventions of a few African-American inventors. Lewis Latimer, Granville T. Woods actually went to court with Thomas Edison, and Granville T. Woods actually won his case.
Thomas Edison tried to bring Granville T. Woods to court on that invention. And I just saw a commercial for Mazda, I believe, cars, where they said, here's a man holding 1,000 patents. Well, 90% of them he stole.
Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison, who are probably considered America's two greatest inventors of all time. But guess who was designing their blueprints for the patent application? A black man. Now let's think about this for a minute. If you invent something, why do you need me to do the blueprints for the patent application? If it's your idea, how in the hell can I do the blueprints for it? You can't do the blueprints for my idea. I have to do them. So if Latimer is doing the blueprints, if he is your chief draftsman and he's doing your blueprints for your patent application, Alexander Graham Bell, did you invent the telephone or did Lewis Latimer invent the telephone?
Thomas Edison had a whole troop of people that was in his sweatshop, and depending on the invention, he would hand it over to that particular department and tell them, see what it is that does, and then do something a little different, and we'll patent that. And when he took Granville T. Woods' information and tried to make it his own, the court said no.
The watermelon in black people stereotype, that came and that was popularized by Thomas Edison. Around 1890, Thomas Edison put together this Nickelodeon reel. And there were these African-American men who were joking around, shucking and jiving and kind of mugging for the camera, and they were eating watermelon. And Edison filmed this, put this out, and the general public saw this, and they said, okay, African-American people must really love watermelon. And right after that film came out, Thousands of postcards and all types of memorabilia flooded the market of African American people eating watermelon. So that watermelon stereotype was popularized by Thomas Edison.
A lot of people don't know there's an African American male who is significant, has patents on the first major computer chips that made computers operate.
Other inventors that we don't know about, essentially, who they call the father of the internet, was Philip Emeagwali, a Nigerian man who essentially created the connection for quantum bits of information so that multiple computers could actually communicate with one another.
During slavery, and this is well documented by white people, many of the masters, when they were sick, did not call for the physician. They called for the big mama on the plantation, and she would come with her medicine bag that didn't have alcohol and rum. It had all types of things that she made from the herbs that she had planted. Some of them said, I don't want the doctor. Bring me the witch doctor, that voodoo woman who I own.
Africans took what they brought from Africa, which would be a ground hockey, and all they did apply the game to ice.
When the British were fighting the United States, there were African slaves or former slaves assisting the British in fighting the U.S. When the U.S. won and the Britons lost, many of the African Americans were sent to British colonies in West Africa, and many of the African Americans were sent into Nova Scotia, Canada, and they formed what we now know as hockey. They started to play this new game called hockey, which was something that Africans were doing in Africa. In ancient Kemet, there was a form of field hockey that they were playing, and they went into Canada and they created what we now know as hockey, and there were actually Black Canadian hockey teams in the early sport of hockey that a lot of people don't know about. And there's a great book about that called Black Ice that talks about the early inventors of hockey who were men of African descent.
Let's clear something here. Yes, black people were denied formal education during slavery. Yes, they were treated as property, and many couldn't read or write. But education is not the same as intelligence. People learn through survival, through observation, through experience. And when your life depends on solving problems every day, you become innovative. Now, here is the real issue. Why don't we know their names? Because legally, they own nothing, not their label, not their ideas. So when they created something, the credit often went to the enslaver. That's not a theory, that was a system. And while some names like Elijah M.C. Cole, Garrett Morgan, and Louis Latimer survived history, these are names history couldn't erase completely. Now imagine how many others never got recorded. Now before we go further, this content is not promoting conflict in any way. This is strictly for educational purpose and to raise awareness about what's currently trending on social media. Credit to all creators whose clips are featured in this episode. So I need you to watch this clip closely.
Europeans never discovered anything. They looted, colonized, and took credit. The myth of European discovery is one of the most arrogant, historically illiterate lies ever told. Europeans didn't discover land, resources, or trade routes. They showed up late, stole shit, and renamed it. Then they rewrote themselves into the history books as pioneers. If someone breaks into your house, kills half your family, renames your living room, and tells everyone that they discovered it, that's what European exploration actually was. Columbus did not discover America. I hope you know that. Millions of people already lived here. He never even set foot in what is currently the United States. He landed in the Caribbean, got lost, then spent his time terrorizing, enslaving, and murdering the Taino people. The indigenous peoples of the Americas were thriving for 10,000 years before Columbus was even born. The Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas had cities, infrastructure, agriculture, as well as advanced knowledge of astronomy and engineering. The Norse, or the Vikings, reached North America 500 years before Columbus. But even they weren't discovering anything because indigenous people were already there. If Columbus had discovered the Americas, that would mean that you could walk into a McDonald's, discover it, and then own it. It isn't discovery, it's theft. Nor did Europeans discover Australia. Aboriginal Australians had been living there for 65,000 years. The oldest continuous civilization on Earth is Aboriginal Australia, with art, culture, and land management techniques dating back tens of thousands of years. When the British discovered Australia in 1770, they declared it terra nullius, meaning nobody's land, despite over 250 indigenous nations already living there. The British then slaughtered, oppressed, and displaced Aboriginal peoples for centuries, turning their homeland into a penal colony for British criminals. Europeans didn't discover trade routes to Asia. The Silk Road and Indian Ocean trade existed for thousands of years before Europeans even knew what a compass was. The Silk Road connected China, India, the Middle East, and Africa for 1,500 years before the Europeans even got involved. The Indian Ocean trading network, dominated by Arabs, Persians, Indians, and East Africans, had already been running for centuries before Spain and Portugal tried to muscle their way in. The Chinese Admiral Zheng He led massive expeditions across the Indian Ocean in the early 1400s, decades before the Portuguese even figured out how to round Africa. Europeans didn't discover Africa, which, if you believe that, what am I doing? Africa had thriving empires and global trade before Europeans even left their villages. Europeans like to pretend that Africa was a dark continent before they arrived, but that's complete bullshit. The Mali Empire between the 13th and 16th century was one of the wealthiest civilizations on Earth, with a vast trade network spanning across the Sahara. The Swahili coast had advanced maritime trade connecting India, Africa, and the Middle East centuries before the Europeans even showed up. Timbuktu was a major intellectual center, home to one of the world's oldest universities. When the Portuguese first arrived in West Africa, they didn't discover it. They had to ask permission from the African kings to set up trade ports. They didn't discover anything. They didn't civilize anything. They didn't modernize anything. They looted, colonized, and rewrote history. White people have never been a majority. Anywhere. Ever. White supremacists love to claim that white people are a default majority in certain regions and are now being replaced. The truth? White people have never been a global majority. Not even in Europe. Not even in the US. Not even at the peak of their global dominance. At every point in recorded human history, the majority of people have been from Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Not from Europe. In the ancient world, the largest populations were always in China, India, and Africa. After 1500 CE, even during European colonial expansion, Asia alone had more people than Europe, Africa, and the Americas combined. Today, white Europeans and their descendants only make up about 11 to 12% of the world's entire population. There's never been a time in history when white people were even close to being a majority. Even within Europe itself, white as an identity is a modern invention, and different groups fought and defined themselves more by class, religion, and culture than by race. Ancient Europe was a mix of Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, Middle Eastern, and Mediterranean influences. Southern Europe, Italy, Greece, Spain, and Portugal, has always been heavily mixed with African, Asian, and Middle Eastern influences. The Ottoman Empire controlled much of Southern and Eastern Europe for centuries, integrating people from Turkey, North Africa, and the Balkans. The idea that Europe was ever a racially homogeneous white homeland is pure fiction. White supremacists claim that the U.S. was originally a white nation. The truth is, indigenous people were the majority for 13,000 years before white settlers arrived. The U.S. was built on stolen land, with a population of African slaves making up a significant portion of early American labor. Mass European immigration in the late 1800s and early 1900s artificially increased the white population. The 1790 Naturalization Act restricted citizenship to free white persons, specifically to inflate white numbers. White people only became a numerical majority in North America because of land theft, genocide, and racist immigration policies. Despite European colonial rule, Latin America was never majority white. Spain and Portugal ruled, but never whitened the continent. They intermarried with indigenous and African peoples, creating a racially mixed society. Most of Latin America today is mestizo, mixed indigenous and European descent, or Afro-Latinx. Even Argentina and Chile, often considered the whitest Latin American countries, have significant indigenous and non-European ancestry. At no point has Latin America ever been majority white. It's always been majority indigenous, black, or mixed race. South Africa and other white settler colonies were never white majority. In South Africa, white settlers ruled under apartheid but were never more than 10% of the population. In Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, the British and Afrikaners held political dominance but never numerical majority. In Kenya, Algeria, and other European colonies in Africa, whites controlled the economies and government but were always a tiny fraction of the population. White rule was based on military dominance, not numbers. During the height of European colonialism from the 1800s to the early 1900s, white Europeans controlled vast territories but never outnumbered the people they ruled. The British Empire, the largest in history, ruled over 400 million people, most of them South Asian, African, and Middle Eastern. The French Empire controlled huge areas of Africa and Indochina, but never outnumbered the locals. White supremacists like to claim they're being replaced, but they've never been a global majority, so how can they be replaced? Non-white populations are simply growing because of normal demographics. White birth rates are declining due to social and economic factors, not some kind of conspiracy. White people aren't being replaced. They were never the world's dominant population to begin with.
Now, about Africa. Long before colonization, Africa had advanced learning centers, mathematics, medicine, architectures. Places like ancient libraries and universities held knowledge that influenced the wider world. So the idea that intelligence came from one place alone, that's simply not true. This conversation is not saying one group did everything. It's about saying everyone deserves accurate credit, because history wasn't always written to be fair. It was written by those in power. So if you're black watching this, don't let history make you question your intelligence. You come from people who adapted under pressure, created under restriction, survived under system designed to erase them. That's not wickedness. That's genius in disguise. If you believe history should be fully told, not partially, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, share this video, because the truth doesn't spread by itself. People have to share it. And today, the person is you. And don't forget to turn your notification bell so you don't miss the next conversation like this. See you in my next episode.